Welcome to this edition of Peak Performers Podcast with your host, Thor Conklin. Thor will be sharing the necessary tools, strategies, and psychology you'll need to become a peak performer in any area of your life or business.
Welcome back to another episode of the Peak Performers Podcast. I'm your host, Thor Conklin, and today we have Andrew Tarvin. He's the world's first humor engineer. This should be very funny, at the very least. Teaching people how to get better results while having more fun. I got to tell you something. I was thinking about this when I was doing the prep on the interview. This is something that I struggle with. So if you can get me to have more fun in what I'm doing, I'm going to call this a success. Even if nobody listens to the show, I'm going to get something out of it. So I appreciate having you on. I get kind of stuck in that rut sometimes of like do, and forget to have fun in the process. So we're going to have some fun today. Combining his background as a project manager at Procter Gamble with his experience as a stand-up comedian, he reverse engineers his skill of humor in a way that is practical, actionable, and gets results in the workplace. Through his company, Humor That Works, Drew. Oh, that we call it. Do you like Drew or Andrew?
Both. I'll explain. Yeah, I'm happy to explain. Yeah.
He's worked with more than 35,000 people at over 250 organizations, including Microsoft and the FBI. He's a best-selling author and has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Fast Company, and has a TEDx talk that has over 4 million downloads. Well done, man.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited for you to teach me a couple things so I can have more fun in what I do.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just by short nature, my full name is Andrew, but I go by Drew because it's the most efficient form of the name. Only 4 letters, 1 syllable. I like it.
I should have added that to the bio as well. Not only is it actionable, but let's make it as succinct as possible. And, it's really interesting because people ask me all the time, after interview, this is close to 650 episodes. So I've had the opportunity not only being an entrepreneur for the last 20 years and working with some amazing people, but you start to see similarities amongst successful people. And I always say, the most successful companies, they have a great idea. They're in a business that is very specific. They have high margins. They have great teams. They know how to execute. And keeping things as simple and succinct as possible is probably the third or fourth thing that I would add in there. So, man, let's have some fun for the next 30 minutes.
Yeah, let's do it. I mean, you're in good company. I mean, along the lines of success is with brevity, and then also I think it was Shakespeare that said brevity is the soul of wit. So you got to have both. And actually, there's a lot of parallels between being successful as a comedian or improviser or stand-up and being successful in the business world, I think.
Interesting. And quick on your feet.
Yeah, absolutely. Being able to react and think in the moment. And I mean, if you think about it, especially like stand-up comedians, they are, 1, phenomenal storytellers. 2, they know how to keep people's attention. And 3, they have to be really smart. They have to be observing the world. They have to be able to articulate ideas in a way that other people understand. Because a lot of times comedians aren't saying things. They're not saying something that's completely like mind-blowingly different. So often in a comedy club, you're like, oh my God, that's so true. Right? They're just articulating it in a way that maybe you haven't thought about before.
Yeah, I also find that they're very good listeners. They have sensory acuity. I was out at a restaurant the other day, and for the second time in a row at the same restaurant, it's a great restaurant, I'm eating my Brussels sprouts with a knife because I didn't have any fork. They didn't bring any forks. So I had a knife. And I realized as I'm having my Brussels sprouts with a knife again, because I'm not one to actually wait for things to happen. I make things happen. So literally I'm sitting there eating. I'm like, wow, this is interesting. I've been here before and I've eaten my Brussels sprouts with a knife. There's got to be something in it. Maybe.
For sure. What's fascinating to me, though, about that story is I imagine other people who aren't there or like who aren't sitting with you looking at you and they're like, is that man stabbing Brussels sprouts? Like, man, he hates them.
Well, good point. I wasn't actually stabbing them. I was using it like a little spatula.
Oh, okay. Or you can...
Yeah, so I could kind of like scoop the side that was cut flat, not the round side, because again, that wouldn't be very smart. They would fall off. But waitresses are walking by left and right, and it's like, doesn't anybody see the guy, as a waiter or a waitress, what are you supposed to be doing? Since you're a cutie, what's going on? Oh, what's going on? Here's a guy eating it with a knife. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know how we got off on that topic, but feel free to add that into your next stand-up comedy.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, to that point though, it's my belief that I don't think that funny things happen to funny people. I think that funny people see the world in a funny way. And exactly to your point that as comedians, you have to be good at listening. You have to be able to step back and observe the world and start to notice. And that's really kind of the first starting point for increasing your humor, is just noticing what makes you go, that's interesting. What are the things that kind of stand out as peculiar or interesting or different to you? So the example that I give in the TEDx talk is that, it took me going to the state of Florida to realize that the rapper Flo Rida got his name, like his rap name, from his home state of Florida, and he put a space in it. That blew my mind, right? That was just like, oh my God, that's something different. And so from that starts with an observation of that's interesting. And then as a comedian, you can start to build off of that using something what's called, if this is true, what else is true? Or yes-anding from the world of improvisation. So you can say, all right, if it's true that one person got their brand from taking their state and putting a space in it, could other places do that? Could you have a Hispanic travel agency in Dover that goes by De La Ware?
Very good. I could actually go by T-Whore. I think I'm going to stick with Thor.
Yeah, I think Thor is probably a little bit better.
In my line of work, I think Thor would be better than that. But I mean, I've got options.
Exactly. It's all about the options.
Or Thor.
Thor, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. I think Thor is definitely better than T-Whore.
Yes. I agree. I actually have a buddy of mine that actually called me that by that nickname. I didn't come up on that one on the fly. No. So, humor. How does humor fit into business?
So let me start with a dumb question, but still kind of want an answer. But would you rather do something that is fun or not fun?
You sound like my business coach right now.
Yeah, it's a dumb question, right? But it stands to reason, right, for anyone kind of listening, it stands to reason that if you were to make your work a little bit more fun, then you're probably a little bit more likely to be engaged in that work. If you were to make your case, say, sales conversations with clients a little bit more fun, they might be a little bit more willing to be engaged and interact with them or want to come to them. So it's just that kind of simple idea that when we enjoy what we do, we get better results. And this isn't just kind of like fluffy woo-woo kind of stuff out there, but this is backed by research, by case studies, by real world examples. There's more than 30 plus benefits to using humor in the workplace. And that's why, for me, that's why I'm passionate about what I do, because my background is in engineering, right? And when people find out that I speak on humor and my degree is in computer science, they're like, wait, that doesn't make sense. But I found humor as a way to almost program humans to get better results and get them to do the things that I wanted to do, whether that was someone on my team when I was at P&G or myself in terms of motivation.
So is there a line that gets crossed, or could there be too much humor? Because I think the first thing I think about is humor is not professional. Sitting there in the suit with the red tie, no expression on the face, being serious about this presentation is more quote unquote professional, and humor seems less professional. So is there a line that you can cross, or does get crossed, that humor and having, not a good time, but enjoying what you're doing crosses that line?
Well, I mean, I think that's a little bit of a mentality that certainly previous generations had, right? This idea that work has to feel like work. And if you are, I'm not calling you old. I'm saying it's maybe an older mindset, the stereotype. The work world is changing. Maybe that made sense in the Industrial Revolution, right? Maybe it made sense when efficiency was everything that we're obsessed with. Maybe it made sense when we actually had something called work-life balance, where when you left home, like when you left work, you actually left work there. But we now live in a world where we have more of this work-life integration where, you get home and maybe you kind of hang out with the family and then you're sending emails at 9 p.m. Or Sunday, you're starting to plan for the rest of the week. And there's no longer this kind of split, this divide between when we're at work and when we're at home. The other thing is that our emotions impact our ability to get work done. In the Industrial Revolution, when you're, creating widgets, your emotions don't necessarily impact as much as, say, creativity. If you're going in and trying to solve problems, if you are stressed out, if you're worn out, if you're tired, if you are in a poor mood, if you have decision fatigue, if you have all these negative things, you're not going to be nearly as effective. And so, one, humor is just one tool, right? It's just like any other tool. It can be used for great benefit. It can be used as a distraction. It can be used kind of incorrectly, for sure. But it is one tool that we can use. So I would say in terms of appropriateness, crossing that line, one of the things I think is important to keep in mind is that using humor in the workplace, the goal is not to be seen as like the funny person in the office. It's not to become a stand-up comedian. It's not to get a Netflix comedy special, but rather it's to get specific results. And so it's not about always using humor in replace of work, but instead saying, okay, I have maybe a specific goal. Maybe I want to get people to pay attention when I'm first starting a meeting. So I'm going to start with a little bit of humor, and then I'm going to get them laughing. And then once they're laughing, they're going to be listening. And then once they're listening, I'm going to get them to learn. I'm going to get them to take action. And so I'm going to use humor specifically to get them to pay attention. And then I'm going to connect that humor to kind of maybe the thesis of my meeting that day. So when we start with that level of kind of intentionality, it no longer becomes a like, oh, that person's not having like, not being serious or not taking their job seriously and what's going on, but more of like, oh, that was an effective way of communicating.
Got it. So I'm all about habits, tools, and ingraining and giving the listening audience actionable items. Mm-hmm. So where do we start? How do we start to incorporate this into our professional life?
There's a couple of things to keep in mind. So the first, probably most important thing that will kind of help set the stage for the rest of it is understanding a humor map. And so when you're looking to use humor in the workplace, we kind of teach a humor map. And your map stands for your medium, your audience, and your purpose. So your medium is how are you going to execute that humor? Is it in an email? Is it in a phone call? Is it in a conference call? Is it in a one-on-one conversation, or is it to a bunch of people? Because we know that our medium impacts our message, right? Like sarcasm, when you're talking with friends, they can kind of see that you're joking. They get a sense that it was just a joke. But if you use sarcasm in an email, sometimes it just comes across as you being very aggressive, right? So the medium impacts the message. The second piece is your audience, and this is who's going to receive that humor, because you want to deliver on what the audience needs, but do it in a way maybe that they don't quite expect, right? Having something a little bit different, a little bit incongruous allows people to pay attention. It gets their attention. And that's another important understanding, is that humor is more broad than comedy. So humor is defined as a comic, absurd, or incongruous quality causing amusement. So it is things like jokes in the workplace, but it is also just something a little bit different, something unique. Maybe it's using images in a presentation instead of a wall full of text. And then the final piece is your purpose. And the purpose is, why are you using humor? Right? It's not just use humor for the sake of humor, but it's use humor to, as I mentioned before, maybe get people to pay attention. Or maybe you use it so that you relieve some stress, so that when you go back into work, you actually are a little bit more engaged. You're not burned out. You're able to kind of attack things at kind of full focus. Maybe the purpose is you want to use humor as a way to brainstorm before trying to solve a problem. Maybe it's you want to use humor as a way to reduce status differentials between you and some of your direct reports, right? Whatever your goal is, that's going to dictate the different types of humor that you might use. And so that map becomes the starting point, that we're doing it again with intention, not just, hey, go and start telling jokes in the workplace.
First thing that came to mind was PowerPoint presentations. Most presentations are dry, boring. There's just no flair to them. And it's real easy to lull your audience into, to sleep. And, I was thinking about, as you were speaking, some of the most impactful presentations I've seen. They've all incorporated some sort of humor in them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a cliche within the speaking industry that says, "Do you have to use humor as a speaker?" And the answer is only if you want to get paid. Right? It's just about effectively engaging the audience, and it's just about kind of maintaining that attention. Like Seinfeld says, there's no such thing as an attention span, only boring content. So when you make your work a little bit more engaging, people are willing to do it. And that's actually kind of how it started for me. I remember, I went to Ohio State University, the Ohio State University. Got to say the, otherwise they take away my degree. But I graduated with a degree in computer science and engineering, and then I started working at Procter Gamble as a project manager. And I remember being in a meeting at P&G that was so boring, like incredibly boring, to the point that I was like watching the paint dry. Like I wished I was doing email. Like, a meeting is boring when you're like, man, I wish I could be doing email right now. And of course, the biggest problem was that I was the one leading the meeting. And it's like, all right, if I'm bored while talking, they have to be bored while listening. And that's when I realized, okay, I want to start to change things. I want to start to make this more fun for myself. And kind of to your point, an easy way that I did that was I remember learning at the time that Hitchcock is in every single one of his films. Like he's a silhouette in the background or a stranger passing by or something like that. So I was like, I want to be in every single one of my presentations. So I started to find excuses to put pictures of me in the presentation, whether it was photoshopping myself into some background or, using a silhouette and data to kind of create my outline, or just a picture of me to kind of start a story. But it created a way for me to stay more engaged in my work. I got more excited about the presentations. And as my audience, as my kind of weekly status report, people started to pick up on it, they started to get excited to be like, all right, where's the picture going to be this week? Right? It made them more engaged because they were like now in on the joke as well.
Interesting. I like that a lot. It's funny because I'm just getting ready to record a webinar on Wednesday. And I was thinking, I was like, all right, where's the humor in the webinar? That was an easy answer.
Yeah.
It's not there.
Exactly.
It's not there.
Right. But I mean, thinking about it, like if you think about sticking on presentations, a couple of ways to really effectively use humor in a presentation. One is use more images, right? In your slides, use images that speak to a point that you're making. So rather than having a bullet point of a bunch of things, have one image that's kind of interesting, something a little bit different, that you can then connect to. So for example, in my presentations, I talk about how you don't always have to be the creator of humor, right? You can be the shepherd of humor. You can be the conduit of humor. You don't have to be the one that made the picture. You don't have to be the one that created the video. You can kind of leverage what other people have already created. And when I give that point, I show a picture of a shepherd with sheep. Right? And I didn't take the picture. I found it under a Creative Commons license and then gave credit in the presentation itself. But now I'm using something, and that's just visually more stimulating than a piece of text that says, be the shepherd of humor. Right? It's just more metaphorical and makes a lot more sense. So visuals, I think, are great for presentations or webinars. And then also things like stories. So I think it's very helpful to start with a story when you're giving a presentation. Of course, sometimes people hear the feedback of, you got to start your presentation with a joke. So they'll go online, they'll research, they'll find some joke, they'll say the joke, it'll be, kind of okay. People will maybe chuckle a little bit. And then the remaining 59 minutes and 30 seconds of the presentation will be awful, and none of it will relate back to the joke. And that's not effective humor, right? Instead, start with the story, or start with at least a joke that's going to connect with the theme that you're going to talk about, so that you can be like, oh, I just shared that story as a way to kind of set the stage for today. What we're going to be talking about is blank, right? In the story itself, that gives you great leeway to then talk about other things that are funny, right? So as you're telling a story, so for example, when I give kind of my background, I'll say, I've always been an engineer. And as an engineer, I've always been obsessed with efficiency ever since I can remember, or really since before I can remember, because I was born 3 weeks early. Right? So apparently even in the womb, I was like, I don't need a full 9 months. I'm ready to do it right now. Right? Let's do this, Mom. Right? And so I don't have to explain any of that efficiency stuff. I could just say I was an engineer and then move on. But by having set it up as a story and by explaining it a little bit more, I can get a couple of laughs, get a couple of punchlines in setting it up. And then I tell the story about being an engineer because it sets the stage for why I'm both obsessed with efficiency, but also recognize that you can't be efficient with humans. And therefore, we have to use humor so that we can be effective with people. So it's kind of setting the stage and telling the story of what it is or why it is that I do what I do.
Besides presentations, where else do you weave in the humor?
So I try to do it in pretty much everything that I do in some way. So for example, when I'm going through email, so as a way to keep myself more productive, you can kind of play your work. So kind of to your point at the top of the podcast, you're like, okay, how do I make this more enjoyable? You can find ways to play your work. Find ways to just make it a little bit more fun or to play a game yourself. So for email, one of the things that I do is whenever I get bored in email, I start to read each of the emails in a different accent in my head. Just as a way to be like, all right, what would be like if this person sounded French? And I'm terrible at accents, but it's a way that I stay a little bit more engaged. Or, if I'm stuck in traffic or I'm commuting, if I'm flying somewhere, then I make sure that I have podcasts that I want to listen to as a way to get to focus on something else or to continue to kind of invest in things, or audiobooks, right? As a way like, oh, I don't have enough time to read, but while I'm riding a bike or while I'm traveling and commuting, I can listen to an audiobook. So finding ways to make it a little bit more fun. Or if I have to do something that I don't like, then I'll try to do it with someone else, right? Like, oh, if I have to do something, can I call up a friend and we both kind of work together for periods of time and then hang out afterwards, right? So there's just different strategies to kind of find ways to make your work a little bit more fun. So I use it in that. Communication is big. I use it as a way to build rapport, particularly with my audiences. But as an introvert, I don't necessarily know, at least growing up, didn't know how to interact with people. I wasn't always so good. I was always much better with computers than humans. And so I developed a 3-step process for networking with people. And that process includes some humor. So step number 1 is to ask interesting questions, right? So we know from like Dale Carnegie that the key to getting people to like you, to win, how to win friends and influence people, is by getting the other person to talk and then shutting up, right? Learning about them. But if you go to a networking event and you ask the same boring questions, you get the same boring answers, and then that conversation doesn't stick out to anyone. So, everyone's going to ask, what do you do? So instead of asking, what do, you can kind of tweak the question a little bit, make it a little bit more fun, add a little bit of humor to it, or incongruity, something a little bit different. Even something as simple as like, hey, what's the coolest thing you've worked on in the last 3 months? Right? Or what's something that you think is true for you that you don't think is true for anyone else in the room? In answering that, though, a lot of times they'll tell you what they do, right? You'll learn what they do, but you'll get a much better story, or you'll get a much more interesting answer from them. And that helps you to build a relationship with them because you stand out as something a little bit different.
All right, you may have noticed that we just lost connection, so we're going to pick up where we got dropped off, and we're going to make this humorous.
Exactly. Yeah, we got to build it. It was just an example of incongruity. It was making sure people were paying attention. Right? Actually, sometimes silence is very helpful. You hear a little bit of silence, you're like, wait, I'm supposed to be hearing noise right now.
Well, you were giving us a 3-step process for networking. So what's number 2?
Yeah, so step number 1 is to ask more interesting or more intriguing questions. Step number 2 is to tell compelling stories. So when people ask you a question, right, sometimes people here ask questions, and so they go to a networking event and then someone asks them a question, they ignore it and go back, right? They just kind of like interrogate the other person. And that makes the person feel like you're being defensive and like weird and kind of standoffish. So if someone asks you a question, you want to answer the question, but rather than just, giving a one-word answer, you can tell a little bit more of a story. And similar to before, telling a story allows you to give a little bit more information. So, for example, when I tell a story with different groups or even in speaking, a lot of times I'll mention that I'm from Ohio. And that way, when people, like if I'm talking to someone also from Ohio, familiar with Ohio, they'll come up to me afterwards and we'll talk about like Grader's ice cream versus, Jenny's ice cream, or the Reds and the Bengals and how they're terrible at sports, but the Buckeyes are good. That kind of thing. If we talk about, if I mention Eddie Izzard, one of my favorite comedians, if the other person knows Eddie Izzard, then we can talk about, like the Death Star Canteen bit or Cake or Death, or like all these other great, funny things that he's done. And then I also mentioned that I'm an introvert, and at least when I'm speaking, if I mention that I'm an introvert, The introverts won't come up and talk to me, but will like make eye contact, across the room. But each time you're saying each one of these things, whether it's a story that they find interesting or the person listening, maybe they latch on to like, oh, you're also from Ohio. Like that's what's helped create a connection and more of an interesting story, or more of an interesting conversation. And then the third step, so that's step number 2. The third step is to continue the conversation. And this is where some ideas or some methodologies from improvisation can be helpful. So the fundamental mindset of improvisation is something called yes and. And you can use that mindset in conversation. If you've ever run out of something to say in conversation, all you have to do is yes and the last thing that the other person said. So for example, if we're talking about the weather, right? And I actually love talking about the weather. I think the weather is fascinating. I don't know if you know this, but there are 1,400 tornadoes in the United States every single year.
1,400?
1,400, yeah. When I heard that, I was blown away.
Ah, very good. Boom, boom, boom.
Exactly. I love puns. I love bad jokes. It's something that's maybe a problem.
But that's 1,400?
Yeah, but 1,400 is a factual statement. There is truth in comedy, right? Yep. In fact, I looked up how many tornadoes there were for that joke to be accurate. But whenever someone, even if someone is talking about the weather, right? Say that, they come up and they're like, hey, how about this weather? Right? You can be like, yes. And if you weren't at this networking event, how would you be enjoying that weather if it's nice out? Or how would you be avoiding the rain if it's raining? And whatever it is, you're connecting to the weather. And now you've turned a conversation about the weather into maybe one of their hobbies or something a little bit more interesting, where again, you're going to connect on a deeper level than just something superficial about, hey, we talked about the weather.
Yeah. It's interesting because I find in networking, I'm very good in interjecting humor or stories. I'm very extroverted, so I'm very comfortable, just doing and talking about whatever and wherever the conversation goes. And it reminded me, I was at a tech village, actually. That's a startup incubator here in town, and they were doing a pitch that night. And after the show, or after the presentations, a buddy of mine said, hey, I want to introduce you to Sarah. So I thought it was a good friend of his, right? I had no idea. So walk over, there's Sarah. He said, hey, Sarah, this is Thor. Thor is Sarah. And I'm like, you're the Sarah. And she kind of looks at me and goes, well, my buddy Slade has a tattoo on his lower back with the name Sarah on it. So you must be the Sarah. I've been dying to meet you for like years. And here you are. And she's like, no, I just met him in line walking in today. I'm like, oh my God. I mean, talk about like this just being like the perfect scenario. Here you are. He's already got the tattoo. When's the wedding? So,
which is perfect.
It was perfect. So, it's funny because that just comes natural to me. I love teasing people. I love interjecting and just taking a story from wherever it goes. But I think there's two sides. It's like there's that side when I'm interacting with people. That's an interesting thing here. You just kind of reminded me of something. I think when I'm interacting with people, I can't speak today, people, that just naturally comes out. But when I get in kind of like tech mode or content mode or work mode, it all shifts for me. So I think it'd be interesting to understand how I can take that extroverted networking, human connection, playfulness, and interject that into maybe I should name my monitor like Betty.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say
I got it. It's Betty. Betty, yeah. Every morning
I like it, and
go ahead.
No, I was going to say the beautiful thing though, and I actually used to do this at P&G, was I named my computer Mackenzie, and then whenever I needed to block out work, I would schedule a meeting with Mackenzie so that it was clear, it was blocked out on my calendar, and people couldn't like schedule another meeting. And so, yeah, right. We can name our machines.
I love that.
But I mean, I think you just touched on an important thing that's helpful for people to recognize is that so often that like in their personal lives, people probably have a great sense of humor. They have fun. They laugh with their friends. They make jokes. Maybe they're even a little bit silly. Maybe they, sing in the shower, dance in the kitchen, whatever. And then when they go into the workplace, something changes, right? They put on a work face and they feel like they have to be the shell of a human. And the reality is that impacts your ability to get work done. In fact, with some research done at Google under a project called Project Aristotle, they looked at 180 teams, 180 attributes for each one of those teams, and over the course of 2 years, because I wanted to find what are the most important attributes for an effective team. Was it team size? Was it personality style? Was it leadership style? Was it, team makeup, whatever? And they found the number one most important attribute was psychological safety. And psychological safety is kind of defined as two ideas. The first is that people felt like they could be their authentic self at work, right? That they didn't have to put that work face on. They didn't have to try to pretend to be someone that they're not. They didn't have to try to act like a robot when in fact they are a human. And then two, the second component of psychological safety is that if people make a mistake or if they mess up, that they won't be made fun of or reprimanded for it, right? Again, because it's human nature to make mistakes. If we're doing something new, we aren't going to always be perfect, but and this is something that it took me a while to learn from improv, is that failure is just data.
There you go. I talk about it all the time. If you follow me on Facebook, every Monday I have failure video. Hey, failed again. I mean, everything that we've done in life, other than pooping and peeing, we had to learn through failure. Tying our shoes, speaking, going to anything, math, everything. Now we become adults, and it's like, we can't fail. No, keep failing. Just keep moving forward.
Yeah, if we didn't if we only ever did the things that we never failed at, like you said, poop and pee, like we also would never have gotten past crawling, right? We would all be crawling around on the floor. We'd never be walking because the first time you tried to walk, you fell down.
And breathing, obviously, too. And then, then pooping and peeing correctly where it needs to go took some training as well, right? I mean, we didn't do that.
That's true. Yeah.
I don't know how we got on pooping and peeing on this show. But and now you've got my creative juices running, all right? Because now my computer's Betty, and I'm like, how can I have a little bit more fun when Betty and I are working together?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
I could get like my thinking cap on. I'm sure on Amazon there's a thinking cap.
I'm sure there is.
I could make a cap out of tin foil.
And this will be the moment when we realize that Thor became a conspiracy theorist online.
Right, and I got a little Viking, or not a gladiator. Got a little gladiator hood with a little, gladiator.
I could help, but I would say, like, I think that in a way, like, just because again, humor is more broad than comedy, it doesn't have to be, this outrageous or different thing. The fact, via video, I can see you have Mr. Incredible as an action figure behind you. You have Imagine, Create, Live up there. You have some cool, I think that's a gong.
It is.
Right? Yep. Yeah, those are all kind of incongruous pieces where, maybe none of those things is like, I'm going to laugh out loud hysterically by seeing them, but it's just showing a little bit more personality is something a little bit different, and that's what we're talking about. When we're talking about humor in the workplace, we're not talking about making the workplace funny so much as making the workplace a little bit more fun.
There's only 3 of us in my office, so, no one is really going to see this, but what it made me think of is that the way we dress has a lot to do with our mindset. When professional athletes go out on the field, they lace up their shoes, they put on that jersey, and then all of a sudden it's game time. A lot of times, when you talk to CPAs, attorneys, very kind of professional, conservative industries, lawyers, for example, many times you hear wives of lawyers say, he treats me like, defendant when I come home, because we have that outfit on, we have that uniform on, and there's no reason why we can't change up our uniform in a job, in a not respectful way, but in an appropriate way, just changing up the environment to have a little bit more, because it is true. When we are having fun, we are more creative. It makes the time go by quicker. We're easier to be around. And I think just things start to flow much, much better than when we get into this kind of stuck kind of serious mode. And
very, very much so. Yeah. And the average person will work 90,000 hours in their lifetime, right? 90,000 hours. That's longer than everything on Netflix, right? That is a really long time. And you start to realize, like, okay, if we're going to spend that much time at work, we might as well find ways to enjoy it. And I mean, speaking of specifically to uniforms, my brother is a professor at Texas A&M, and his like small thing that he does is he wears interesting socks every single day, like whether it's Cat's on it or Einstein's face or whatever. And it becomes, again, it's the rhythm, the continual use of humor. His students find out about it and they always then get excited, like, oh, what socks does he have on today? Like, it just becomes a small point of differentiation that like people are now interested in, engaged in. And that's something that most groups can do. Like, yeah, you could wear interesting socks if you wanted to.
And you just hit on something. I think you alluded to it earlier, is curiosity. Mm-hmm. It's that curiosity that's seeking. I always say to folks, if I don't want them to think about something, I always tell them, whatever you do today, do not think about executing at the highest level. Or, whatever you do today, don't think about, whatever, being a great leader. Mm-hmm. Well, what do they think about immediately?
Absolutely. It's like saying, don't think about a pink elephant.
Exactly. Exactly. And curiosity, if you set the stage that people are looking for something, and that's where we learn, is when we're seeking and we're looking for something. I like this.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's really the starting point, and kind of back to the humor, and you're talking about habit. So probably the biggest strategy, certainly the map helps. Understanding that humor is more broad than comedy helps, but what we really kind of leave our audiences with, and this is the book that recently came out. There's 10 humor strategies for using humor in the workplace, but the bonus strategy, the most important one, is to simply think 1 smile per hour. Each hour of the day, try to find at least one thing that you can do that brings a smile to your face or the face of someone else. And if you use that as a starting point, yeah, you're going to find what natural ways work for you. And then from that, you'll kind of grow and evolve. Because this doesn't mean immediately starting tomorrow that every single thing that you do has to try to be funny, but it's more about, okay, this next task that I'm working on, how can I make it a little bit more fun? Or this next meeting that I'm going into, how can I use a little bit of humor to build a better relationship with some of my team, right? It's just something thinking about, okay, what is 1 smile per hour that I can do each hour?
Love it. If you have trouble with that, just set an alarm on your iPhone to go off every hour.
Exactly.
Love it. Drew, man, I appreciate having you on. This is awesome. We're going to have a link in the show notes on how to order the book. Mm-hmm. Final word, man.
Final word, I would say, is another statement that I'll ask the listeners to think about and say whether or not they agree or disagree with. All right, so they can think about whether they agree or disagree with this statement. All right, you are responsible for your own happiness.
Agree.
And think about that. I would say I agree with that statement. And that means that, if you don't like your job, if you don't like a project that you're working on, if you don't like a certain task that you have to do, it's up to you to change that situation. And I don't think it's necessarily, that means everyone quit their jobs and try to become stand-up comedians or move to Tahiti or whatever, but more about kind of changing your perspective, because it's not up to your manager, it's not up to your coworkers, it's not up to your clients to make sure that you enjoy what you do. It's a choice that you make every single day. And so, I would encourage people to choose to be more productive, less stressed, and happier, to choose to get better results and have more fun, to choose humor in the workplace.
Yeah, it most definitely is a choice. And it's so interesting because, we live in a society, we're blessed. You and I are both here in the United States. There's 6 billion people on the planet that would cut their right arm off just to have one of our worst days. Mm-hmm. We get into this bubble of, life isn't going well. I'm not, look, there are a lot of people hurting around the world. Mm-hmm. And we are really, really blessed.
We absolutely are. In fact, there's 3 kind of like really well-proven strategies for increasing your overall base happiness. Number 1 is gratitude, like you said, is having a gratitude journal, writing 3 things down each day that you're grateful for. And gratitude, it doesn't have to be that extreme. It can be as simple as, I answer the question of what's not wrong with my life. right? It doesn't even have to be, this is what's amazing. It's just, this isn't what isn't wrong. Oh, I had a great meal today. Oh, I did a cool podcast, right? Very simple. So gratitude is number one. Social support is number two. We are very much affected by other people's mood. So when you can find your friends that, are positive and make you laugh and smile, can be a great help to your boost to your happiness. And then number three is humor. Humor is one of the healthiest adaptations to life. And Kurt Vonnegut said that laughter and tears are equal responses to frustration. I myself prefer to laugh because there's less cleaning up to do afterwards. And so finding that perspective, having fun.
Drew, I appreciate having you on, man, as always. And look forward to having you back on the show.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks for having me.
All right, buddy. Thank you.